Richardson is Professor of English, Comparative Literature, and American Studies at CUNY's Graduate Center. She is the author of a 2-volume biography of the poet Wallace Stevens, and she co-edited with Frank Kermode Wallace Stevens' Collected Poetry and Prose. Her essays on Stevens, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Jonathan Edwards have been published in the Wallace Stevens Journal and Raritan. Other essays and reviews have appeared in Configurations, the Hopkins Review, Book Forum, and other journals. Richardson's study, I need oxygen. Richardson's study, A Natural History of Pragmatism, The Fact of Feeling from Jonathan Edwards to Gertrude Stein, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2007, has been nominated for the 2011, how do you pronounce that? Grauermeyer Award in Religion. She is currently at work on another volume, Pragmatism with American Culture, as well as a book-length study, The Return of the Repressed, Stanley Cavell and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Joan Richardson will host this evening's event and introduce our other distinguished guest. So take it away, Joan.
Okay.
I think you could sit down there and do that, and then usually we just keep the, and then afterwards when you read, if you'd like to just come up and read, that can work well too.
We'll figure it out. Yeah. Okay. Susan Howe and I have been friends for quite a long time now, and it feels as though we've known each other in a current of universal being, as it were, because of our common interests in Wallace Stevens and other writers. Susan is the author of many, over a dozen books of poetry, the most recent of which are This, for which she was awarded the Bollingen Prize, a very wonderful prize in American poetry. Souls, before that, Frolic Architecture, which she completed while on a fellowship at the American Academy at Berlin. Souls of the Labadee Track, an extraordinary volume. Her critical study from years ago, My Emily Dickinson, was reissued in 2007 with an introduction by Elliot Weinberger. And she recently released 2 CDs in collaboration with the musician-composer David Grubbs. Howe held the Samuel P. Capon Chair in Poetry and the Humanities at the State University, New York at Buffalo until her retirement in 2007. She's the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, and she has been elected to the American Academy of, she was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1999, and served as Chancellor to the American Academy of Poets between 2000 and 2006. Susan we're going to begin our conversation with Susan reading a piece that she has composed. I think she may stop and elaborate parts around it, or I may interrupt her, or you might want to ask questions along the way. I think that would be all right, so that our conversation includes all of you. And I'm going to, we don't have enough handouts of the poems that Susan is going to be referring to, but if you look on with your friends near you, that'll be fine. I'm getting so do you want to stand here?
Sure. I'm going to be, part of what I'm doing is reading some of his poems, but I'm just too nervous to just have a casual conversation. So this is the way I'm starting. And I just have to say that Joan Richardson, this book that she edited with Frank Kermode, is like my Bible. It's completely, I would like it to be buried with me, actually. It's completely fallen apart, but it's just wonderful. And it's by far, if those of you who want to get, a complete idea of Stevens, you should have this book because it has his essays, his adagia, and his poetry. Okay, now. The mic is a bit funny. Okay, I'm going to begin by reading. Can you hear me? Is that all right? You can hear me? The first brief poem in the last group that Wallace Stevens collected under the general title The Rock for the Knopf edition of his collected poems, published in 1954, the year before his death. And this is a late autumn poem. An Old Man Asleep. The two worlds are asleep, are sleeping now. A dumb sense possesses them in a kind of solemnity. The self and the earth, your thoughts, your feelings, your beliefs and disbeliefs, your whole peculiar plot, the redness of your reddish chestnut trees, the river motion, the drowsy motion of the river R. The poem may be echoing these lines from Wordsworth's opening of the prelude. Was it for this that one, the fairest of all rivers, loved to blend his murmurs with my nurse's song, and from his alder shades and shallows sent a voice that flared among my dreams? Many echoes flare in the dreams of an old man asleep. There is the relation between the alphabet letter R and the plural form of the present tense indicative mood of B. The two worlds are asleep, are sleeping now. What two worlds? When is now? Is your singular or plural? Are you the reader? Are you the sleeping author? Your peculiar plot can range from a piece of ground to a map on paper or a plan laid according to scale, even to a secret scheme. The two R's in the word river itself, beginning and end. If the first short poem in The Rock is an autumnal sleep or death poem, the last one in the group is a poem of first awakening in spring. Not ideas about the thing, but the thing itself. At the earliest ending of winter in March, a scrawny cry from outside seemed like a sound in his mind. He knew that he heard it, a bird's cry at daylight or before, in the early March wind. The sun was rising at 6, no longer a battered panache above snow. It would have been outside. It was not from the vast ventriloquism of sleep's faded papier-mâché. The sun was coming from outside. That scrawny cry, it was a chorister whose C preceded the choir. It was part of the colossal sun surrounded by its coral rings, still far away. It was like a new knowledge of reality. Is the last word reality, which also becomes the last word in the whole of his collected poems, an R word by chance? How carefully did he plan the order for the poems in The Rock? Are these scattered R letters and sounds there by coincidence, or are they plotted? Can long later poems like Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction, Auroras of Autumn, or An Ordinary Evening in New Haven be considered as single poems or as poems inside poems? Does it matter? From his essay, The Relations Between Poetry and Painting, quote, "These details come together so subtly and so minutely that the existence of relations is lost sight of. This in turn dissipates the ideas of their existence," unquote. And these are two things from Parts of a World Wallace Stevens Remembered, which is a wonderful documentary account by Peter Brazeau, where he interviewed people who'd known Stevens all his life. And this is from two co-workers at the Hartford Accident and Indemnity Company. Manning Hurd, who was his assistant at the Hartford. Before I went, I'd go into his office. He'd say, "Wait a minute, will you do me a favor?" This every time I went. "Will you look up in the Oxford Dictionary the meaning of this word?" And I'd go and I'd just copy the definition, the whole thing, drew the Greek and all that business. Stevens was interested in complete definitions. Sometimes he wanted them to check all dictionaries, double-check words in American and Oxford dictionaries. And this is Charles O'Dowd. The guy I saw using the big dictionary in the law library more than anyone else was Wallace Stevens. R, the 18th letter of the modern and 17th of the Roman alphabet, is derived through early Greek, representing the 20th letter of the early Semitic alphabet. In general, the character denotes an open-voiced consonant in the form of which the point of the tongue hits the palate a little way behind the teeth. In many languages, it is accompanied by a vibration of the tongue, in which case the R is said to be trilled. This trill is almost or altogether absent in the R of modern Standard English. And R, the R months, I don't know if you know what the R months are, but Stevens would have loved this because he was a great eater. Those months in the name of which an R occurs, September through April, during which oysters are in season. R in phonetics. In American English, in all words spelled with R, this is from the Oxford Dictionary, there is an R sound which occurs simultaneously with the vowel before it. The vowels in such cases are said to be recolored. R is the dog's letter and hurreth in the sound, Benjamin Jonson, English Grammar, 1640. R's whose lower limbs beyond the upper bulged unseemly out. I like that one. Carolyn B. Southey, Works, 1867. In literature, the intrusive R is frequently indicated as a characteristic mark of vulgarity. Of Latin words of phrases, RX, king, Regina, queen, RIP, requiescat in pace. Of English words and phrases, capital R stands for proper names as Richard, Robert, etc. Caps R stands for rabbi, radius, railway, river, rogue, rough, royal, RA, rear admiral, RSVP. Wallace Stevens was born in Reading, spelled Reading, Pennsylvania. Some of his aliases are Redwood Roamer, Large Red Man Reading, Rugged Roy, the Jackrabbit, a rabbit as king of the ghosts. In Pragmatism, William James writes, both the sensational and the relational parts of reality are dumb. They say absolutely nothing about themselves. We it is who have to speak for them. Stevens writes about what we see without ever quite being able to say. This is the Song of Fixed Accord, the 11th poem in the rock. Ruku spoke the dove, like the sooth lord of sorrow, and a hail bow, to this morrow. She lay upon the roof, a little wet of wing and woe, and she rued there. Softly she piped among the suns and their ordinary glare. The sun of 5, the sun of 6, their ordinariness, and the ordinariness of 7, which she accepted like a fixed heaven, not subject to change, day's invisible beginner. The Lord of love and of sooth sorrow lay on the roof and made much within her. In experimental transactions with concrete particulars, he sounds the myriad shifting sensations, prediscursive, fragmentary, predictable, of seemingly simple objects, weathers, hours, seasons, and events. This fluid interaction between reality, intuition, and imagination is the benevolent, relentless vitality of nature and of poetry. Here's the last poem in his first collection, Harmonium, 1923. To the roaring wind. What syllables are you seeking, vocalissimus, in the distances of sleep? Speak it. And here's one of his last poems, published after the collected works, The Course of a Particular. Today the leaves cry, hanging on branches swept by wind. Yet the nothingness of winter becomes a little less. It is still full of icy shades and shapen snow. The leaves cry. One holds off and merely hears the cry. It is a busy cry concerning someone else. And though one says that one is part of everything, there is a conflict, there is a resistance involved, and being part is an exertion that declines. One feels the life of that which gives life as it is. The leaves cry. It is not a cry of divine attention, nor the smoke drift of puffed out heroes, nor human cry. It is the cry of leaves that do not transcend themselves in the absence of fantasia, without meaning more than they are, in the final finding of the ear, in the thing itself, until at last the cry concerns no one at all. Yet the nothingness of winter becomes a little less. It is still full of icy shades and shapen snow. Shapen is an obsolete past participle. This wild word relic softly and serenely concerns no one. Its pastness enters in the sough of wind through pitch pines, in the absence of fantasia, without meaning more. Pleasure springs from the sense of fluid sound patterns that phonetic utterance excites in me. Wallace Stevens' poems make me happy. This is the simple truth. The pleasure I feel while reading his poetry is intuitive. It's important to remember that sense of mystery felt before reason or interpretation checks us. As teachers and critics, we are encouraged to say more and more about the picture of the poem or the artist that inspired us, and say it in prose, often accompanied with footnotes. In doing so, we lose our first feeling of union and bliss. And I think that stanza 3 in the Auroras of Autumn speaks to this sense of primal loss. It is evening, the house is evening, half dissolved. Only the half they can never possess remains, still starred. It is the mother they possess who gives transparence to their present peace. She makes that gentler that can gentle be. And yet she too is dissolved. She is destroyed. She gives transparence, but she has grown old. The necklace is a carving, not a kiss. I adore that line, the necklace is a carving, not a kiss. It's an incredible line. The self in the earth, your thoughts, your feelings, your beliefs and disbeliefs in the first poem. Mutuality and isolation, interdependence and dependence. Where do writer and reader meet? A writer must fix her way of using each word at the same time she realizes that to write for a reader is to admit she is outside the word, at arm's length and alone. A reader's present is contingent. A reader can control how long to remain with you. Each of us leaves words where they are. Words are the only permanence. I'm going to skip one more poem I was going to read, but I'm going on too long. Richard Blackmer, who wrote so well about Stevens, says in Language as Gesture that there always remains, quote, a territory of the poem which we cannot name or handle, but only envisage, unquote. He also adds, the secret perception of readers comes near the secret perception of authors. This sense of the reader's secret perception is for me one of the most mysteriously strong elements in Stevens. It's a passional form of expression, ambiguous, changing. Sometimes it seems to presuppose and envelop one. This is an example of this final soliloquy of the interior paramour in The Rock. Light the first light of evening, as in a room we rest, and for small reason think the world imagined is the ultimate good. This is, therefore, the intensest rendezvous. It is in that thought that we collect ourselves out of all the indifferences into one thing, within a single thing, a single shawl wrapped tightly round us, since we are poor, a warmth, a light, a power, the miraculous influence. Here now we forget each other and ourselves. We feel the obscurity of an order, a whole, a knowledge which arranged the rendezvous within its vital boundary, the mind. We say God and the imagination are one. How high that highest candle, how high that highest candle lights the dark. Out of this same light, out of the central mind, we make a dwelling in the evening air, in which being there together is enough. Speed of the affections and the affects from one state to another. Rendezvous, from the French rendre to render, is a crucial word. Look it up in the Oxford Dictionary and Webster's, and you will find its association not only with romance, but as a place or port fixed upon or suitable for the assembling of troops or armed forces. In ordinary general use, an appointed place for gathering, a place of common resort. You want to interrupt me? Is that what you're saying? Okay, go ahead.
It's one of the things that we found interesting, that I found particularly interesting when Susan and I were putting together what we were going to be talking about, is that of the poems that she selected and the poems that I selected, this one, Final Soliloquy of the Interior Paramour, was the common one. And that I've had the experience that at certain times in my life, I've found myself in the late afternoon thinking of something and going to Stevens and the volume opening to that poem. And, you know, just sort of, it's jumping out and speaking to me as though it had, in fact, drawn me.
Right. Well, I can sit down and talk.
This notion of the same light, the central mind, we make a dwelling in the evening air, in which being there together is enough. In my copy, I have comments of one of these occasions that I just mentioned of coming to this poem, and as the volume opened, I was about to light the first light of evening in my apartment. And it was like, uh-oh, you know, one of those moments of frisson. I'm about to do that, and I found this poem, and I'm coming back to it. And as I read through it again, it was as though the words actually jumped. I mean, they were under my skin, and I was the poem. And this is what Susan knows, what we both know so well about how Stevens has made us happy. And that happiness, I think, is at the deepest level a recognition both of the central part of our beings that we all know in connection with the earth and the light and being on the planet, and also a recognition of, I have found that person at this place feeling what it is that I'm feeling at this same time, and someone else has found it. So there's an enlargement of being constantly through Stevens. For me, Stevens describes the poet as living always in a radiant and productive atmosphere, occupying a radiant and productive atmosphere. And I think that atmosphere for us, I mean, part of what I wanted to say too about the recognition is that Susan mentioned the dictionary and Manning Hurd at the Connecticut, at the Hartford, going and looking up words. Very often, there are poems in Stevens that I still don't understand. I mean, the surfaces are still difficult, opaque, and there's that attraction of the opaque that keeps me going back to them. But at some point, I will find the clue, the key, and it will sometimes be the 14th meaning of the word cape in the OED, and then the poem, breaks open like some kind of radiant new bubble and gives me its meaning, and then I imagine him composing it for me to find, or for a reader. He has an aphorism, there is no reader but one. And that experience of poetry, Stevens says poetry is the scholar's art, and he forces you to become a scholar to not only of him, but of his identification with the planet. He finally ends up he talks about himself as planet on the table and analyzes himself in a late poem in that way. Did you want to say something about that?
About?
Just, the radiant and productive atmosphere.
Well, I just feel I became just fascinated with that question of the R, and then I realized how many words in Stevens begin with R. They're terribly important to him, like romanticism, romantic, reality being the But there's just once you start noticing the way that letter travels from beginning to end of the harmonium to the late start, looking at his the play of letters and sounds through his throughout, that you wonder, did he plot that, or is it an ear or chance, or what is it? And there is no answer.
No, but
it's just incredibly clever.
But there is, for Stevens, it's always, Stevens has an essay entitled The Irrational Element in Poetry, and his attachment to particular sounds. And I think the R sounds for him have a lot to do with the Pennsylvania Dutch background and his mother, and and also with Plato's Cratylus. And Plato's Cratylus, there's a question about the sound of the ro, of the R, and that it symbolizes a transformation of one kind, going from one kind of surface to another. So both of those elements are together. But in that...
But it puns on the word R, A-R-E, too.
All the time,
it's all
yeah.
That kind of thing, too.
What he forces you to do is to understand your own mind as a superpositioning of various elements, that these various kinds of meanings are in play in a radiant way, so that meaning so that meaning doesn't go back and forth across the page, like as an army would march across the page, but that meaning, and in fact we know this now in neuroscience, the way that you come to, it's the sound, and William James knew this, it's the sound of a word which is like a wave packet that triggers all of your known associations to that word, and those associations appear as images, and then your mind selects very, very quickly those that it needs if it's going to offer a particular sentence or make a particular case, but they're all in play there for a while, and Stevens tries to capture as many of those as possible in a poem. So of course the poems don't make sense in a sort of rational, across the line way. They make sense in this recreation of the radiant and productive atmosphere of the mind itself and how it makes its adjustment to reality. But I wanted to read part of that essay, The Irrational Element of Poetry, where he describes how it is that a particular experience of his triggers the making of a poem, and it's a very beautiful description. Just have to... I'm going to skip around and say it's a long essay, but I'm going to skip around in it so that you get a sense of it. I am not competent to discuss reality as a philosopher, Stevens says. All of us understand what is meant by the transposition of an objective reality to a subjective reality. The transaction between reality and the sensibility of the poet is precisely that. A day or two before Thanksgiving, we had a light fall of snow in Hartford. It melted a little by day and then froze again at night, forming a thin, bright crust over the grass. At the same time, the moon was almost full. I awoke once several hours before daylight, and as I lay in bed, I heard the steps of a cat running over the snow under my window almost inaudibly. The faintness and strangeness of the sound made on me one of those impressions which one so often seizes as pretexts for poetry. I suppose that in such a case one is merely expressing one's sensibility, and that the reason why this expression takes the form of poetry is that it takes whatever form one is able to give it. And then I'm going to skip on. In the same essay, he quotes a French critic, Monsieur Bremont, who elucidated a mystical motive and made it clear that, in his opinion, one writes poetry to find God. I should like to consider, Stevens says, this in conjunction with what might better be considered separately, and that is the question of meaning in poetry. Monsieur Bremont proposed the identity of poetry and prayer, and Stevens' poems are forms of prayer, but secular versions of prayer that will attach us to the actual exquisite mystery of the planet that we're part of. And the identity, and followed Bergson in relying in the last analysis on faith. And Stevens goes, all mystics approach God through the irrational. Pure poetry is both mystical and irrational. If we descend a little from this height and apply the looser and broader definition of pure poetry, it is possible to say that while it can lie in the temperament of very few of us to write poetry in order to find God, it is probably the purpose of each of us to write poetry to find the good, which in the Platonic sense is synonymous with God. It is conceivable that a poet may arise of such scope that he can set the abstraction of this, on which this depends, to music. When we find in poetry that which gives us a momentary existence on an exquisite plane, is it necessary to ask the meaning of a poem? I mean, that's just that momentary existence on an exquisite plane is one of, I think it's a phrase that comes back to me at least 3 times a week. I mean, it's one of those things from Stevens that is part of the scrim through which I see my world. And I can honestly say that I've been educated by tracking things that I still have not found, tracking things back through Stevens to wherever it is I think they may have come from, following his reading and following, different adventures through the dictionary, for example.
Did anybody have any want us to ask, say anything?
I think that another part that I wanted to, I think setting the stage for why Stevens wanted to write this kind of poetry is an important aspect of his work. Stevens lived at a moment where many things that were familiar to generations before were vanishing. The pastoral, he could walk out of Reading and into the landscape around Reading, and it was as it had been for the 150 years previous. It was unspoiled. And after he moved to New York as a young man, going to law school for a while, he would make it a habit to walk out of the city and walk sometimes 20 or 40 miles into New Jersey to be able to be in nature and to have that sense of for him, that experience in nature replaced the religion that he had been raised in, which was the Dutch Reformed Presbyterian, and he made that shift very gracefully as he, at Harvard, was realizing that the faith that he had been reared in was disappearing for him, but he's nonetheless yearned for something that would ground his experience, an attachment to something larger than himself. And he mourned that groves were not still sacred, for example. And at one point, he gradually shifts his sense of the sacred from the restrictive description of the sacred as he had been taught as a young boy, and it moves to his looking and scrutinizing not only immediate nature, but the nature of the physicists as he was moving through his time. And this is part of how he understood reality and how he translated. Stevens addressed himself persistently to, in his words, the fact of feeling ourselves expelled from the cosmic poem of the ascent into heaven. And he felt that as a great loss, the loss of the mythology of heaven and hell being tremendously great. Now, creatures not of a part, which is our everyday limitation, but of a whole, for which, for the most part, we have as yet no language. So he found himself in a place at a cultural moment where there was nothing there was no grounding to how to define why we're here as human beings, who we are as human beings, what is this place, and why are we doing what we're doing. For the most part, we have as yet no language, where yet the absence of imagination had itself to be imagined. Within this whole, our cosmic epoch, a society of electromagnetic occasions, a society of electrons and protons, as Alfred North Whitehead dispassionately described, these creatures, the primates we happen to be, are nothing more than temporal transformations of patterning electrons and protons. Individuality, the transformation of a definite train of recurrent waveforms. This was Alfred North Whitehead describing the reality of where we find ourselves as human beings in 1926 as Stevens is writing his first poems. According to the language of physics, this is Whitehead, the aspects of a primate are merely its contributions to the electromagnetic field. This is in fact exactly what we know of electrons and protons. An electron for us is merely the pattern of its aspect in its environment, so far as those aspects are relevant to the electromagnetic field. So that's the physical description. And then Stevens translates what this field, what receiving this information and trying to experience it and translate it feels like. And he offers the following. The material world, for all of the assurances of the eye, has become immaterial. It has become an image in the mind. The solid earth disappears, and the whole atmosphere is subtilized not by the arrival of some venerable beam of light from an almost hypothetical star, but by a breach of reality. What we see is not an external world, but an image of it, and hence an internal world. Thus, poetry becomes and is a transcendent analog composed of the particulars of reality, created by the poet's sense of the world, that is to say, his attitude as he intervenes and interposes the appearances of that sense. So every poem for Stevens is that kind of an intervention. All right, I am simply electrons and protons, but I'm registering them and translating them into this pattern at this moment. As he commented, whether one arrives at the idea of God as a philosopher or as a poet matters greatly. We recall William James. To think, to sustain a representation, then, is the only moral act. Stevens, the poet of the modern world, extending himself into the difficulty of what it is to be, resisted the temptation to fall into categories of substance, instead sustaining in the vibratory breaths of each of his imaginings the exquisite critical opalescence that is our actual condition as our and all matter on the planet revolving around its sun slowly dissolves into light. So it's this constant sense of our beings as poet creating all that we have to negotiate our being in the world that Stevens is celebrating, and that Susan is celebrating as well. You want to say something?
You're right. But at the same time, fundamentally, he's a poet writing words in a room. You know, I don't know. There's something about Stevens that I find so. I sort of think of him as in a tower, just in his. He was so solitary, and well, he worked all day at the insurance company, but he obviously must have worked into the night on his poetry. Or there's just a figure for me that's so solitary but radiant and also intimate. And I just don't know how he pulls, it's just so amazing how he pulls that off. That sense of being oneness with the reader and yet being very much pushing, it's a push and pull thing. I can't describe it, but it's yes.
I wonder if you run into any reference to music in anything he said.
Well, he loved me. I mean, yes, there. I know. It just, that's right.
Beethoven.
Well, I was just reading in is the Novel Writers? One of them has a whole thing about Beethoven. He writes about Beethoven actually, but about his effort to you would know to.
This poem, Peter Quince.
Oh well. Yeah. Well, no, but go on. I mean, what do you find?
He says music is
Yeah.
Well,
it is.
yeah, but he says music is feeling then, not sound. And that's a wonderful example because it raises all of the things seem to be what they are, but they're not, because a clavier is either a cardboard, keyboard, or it's a real instrument, or there's no certainty about who Peter Quince is and what is this clavier. It's an imagined, and then music is feeling then, not sound. How do we read the then? Is it feeling, music is feeling then, and then...
The other thing about that is Peter Quince is also, to me, calls up Quint in Henry James, The Turn of the Screw, and Shakespeare. He does those two things at once. So I constantly think with him, not only of music, but of Shakespeare. There's just this sense of the music of Shakespeare.
And the end of The Turn of the Screw is just like the end of Schubert's Broken.
Oh, that's
The
wonderful.
last line.
Yeah.
And it winds up in
Oh, that's great. That's so interesting. I've just been listening to that Schubert, so yeah.
That's wonderful, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, the thing about both superpositionings of the different references of things in Stevens' poems and what you bring up about his solitariness, his solitude, it's as though, and another way that it's a radiant, productive atmosphere is that he composes his poems only when he walks. He doesn't compose when he's still. In the seasons when he couldn't walk, he didn't write. If there was too icy, he didn't write. So there was something about that movement, and as he would walk back and forth from the office, or then sometimes go to Elizabeth Park, I think all of, Stevens and William James and Emerson and Henry James, Jonathan Edwards, they're my imaginary friends, and I talk to them all the time. And I had actual imaginary friends as a child. I was an only child. Peter and Helen, and they sat at the table. Anyway, these other interlocutors are with me all the time, and for Stevens, that's the case too, like going to the Schubert or the Shakespeare. It's like each of those phrases or suggestions is like a portal into a current of the universal being. That is, he's remembering his own connection to reading certain texts or being moved by certain texts. Visiting the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, and looking at his notations on his texts of Spencer or Emerson, or all of those things are very, very moving, because you see how they're transformed and how they made. He describes people, men made out of words. We are the words we choose to continue to enchant ourselves with.
Because Joan mentioned scrim, and thinking and the walking. I visited Elizabeth Park because that's on his way to, he walked a lot in Elizabeth Park in Hartford. And, that's crucially important. He passed it every day on his way to work. And it is an incredible park. And what's incredible about it to me, it's so explained. See, it's as though it's in this dull city, Hartford, and there's this incredible rose garden that's been made by, flower lovers, a communal rose garden in the city. And there's certain places in the park where you can't see that you're in a city, but it's like a European garden. And it's as though you're looking at something, German romanticism, and I always think of the Midsummer Night's Dream when I walk in there. And I think that it's as though for an American, it's of his sensibility, it's as though it's a scrim. And behind in the rose garden and in the arbor and the perennial garden, Puck and Titania are going to step out. It's peopled with European figures in some unique way, that park. And I think that's always in his, it amazes me to think that he never went to Europe. I just find that thrillingly interesting about Stephen, because he was too poor when he was young, but he could have gone after the war. He never went to Europe, yet he loved. He says French and English are one language. He's just caught up in the sense of what an American poet is in relation to, and I find that the word scrim just brings it all, because, on a stage set, the scrim is solid and then it's transparent. And it's a hidden, I don't know, anyway, it's great you brought up Peter Quince at the
Maybe we should read it. I was thinking of reading Peter Quince.
It's just a wonderful
So I thank you for, bringing it up, and I will read it as one. It is one of my very, very...
It is on page 72.
Thank you. What was that?
What was that? Puck.
Yes.
Peter Quince at the clavier, or clavier. Just as my fingers on these keys make music, so the self-same sounds on my spirit make a music too. Music is feeling then, not sound. And thus it is that what I feel here in this room, desiring you, thinking of your blue-shadowed silk is music. It is like the strain waked in the elders by Susanna. Of a green evening, clear and warm, she bathed in her still garden, while the red-eyed elders watching felt the bases of their beings throb in witching chords and their thin blood pulse pizzicati of Hosanna. 2. In the green water, clear and warm, Susanna lay. She searched the touch of springs and found concealed imaginings. She sighed for so much melody. Upon the bank she stood in the cool of spent emotions. She felt among the leaves the dew of old devotions. She walked upon the grass still quavering. The winds were like her maids on timid feet, fetching her woven scarves, yet wavering. A breath upon her hand muted the night. She turned, a cymbal crashed and roaring horns. 3. Soon, with a noise like tambourines, came her attendant Byzantines. They wondered why Susanna cried against the elders by her side. As they whispered, the refrain was like a willow swept by rain. Anon their lamps' uplifted flame revealed Susanna and her shame. And then the simpering Byzantines fled with a noise like tambourines. 4. Beauty is momentary in the mind, the fitful tracing of a portal, but in the flesh it is immortal. The body dies, the body's beauty lives. So evenings die in their green going, a wave interminably flowing. So gardens die, their meek breaths scenting the cowl of winter, done repenting. So maidens die to the auroral celebration of a maiden's choral. Susanna's music touched the bawdy strings of those white elders, but escaping left only death's ironic scraping. Now in its immortality it plays on the clear vial of her memory and makes a constant sacrament of praise. A wonderful poem. Excuse me?
Well, I was just thinking as she was reading that, when I was in Berlin last year, Rembrandt's painting is in the Gemäldegalerie Gallery there, and I just stood in front of that painting and I thought, oh my God, Wallace Stevens never saw this painting as that, because it just was completely, to see those Rembrandts in the Gemäldegalerie Gallery, and it was so quiet, and it was just so different than seeing those Rembrandt in the Met. It was just a whole other world. And that painting is there, and it's just incredibly beautiful, and I just thought that he never went there and saw it. It's just brilliant.
There's also, he knew the Handel Oratorio, Susanna, and some of the sounds, are reproduced, and it's almost as though he's illustrating. William James has this beautiful perception about, and it's the beginning of what will become pragmatism. This is a perception that he phrases in the Principles of Psychology, where if you take in, if you're moved by having gone to a concert or a theater performance or a painting, that it's very important to translate that feeling into another action. That if you don't translate that feeling into another action that is your ordinary version of it even, that you are eventually going to forget how to feel. That the feeling has to become part of your body. The body's beauty lives. I mean, it's really necessary to engage that practical, that practice, and it is practice. And even the playing the music on the clavier and my fingers making all of it is fantastically instructive. And it's also about how this scrim idea. The movement always between imagination and reality. Yeah, right. And he's always talking about an up and down between two elements, and always very aware of the fact that what we're seeing is a product not only of the outside, but it's that relation. It's what we're bringing to what we're seeing, and adding, as he said, add that to reality. And then when you add that to reality and reflect on what you've added after you've made the poem, then you recognize, he talks at one point about, his studious ghosts. Then he recognizes the echoes of all of those others who are in him as part of that universal center, that shining being. Yeah. Yes?
I just like to comment, I was reading the New Yorker and the review of Fred Stock's movie about
The cave?
there's a line here that says, these images are memories of long forgotten dreams.
Oh, that's
I
so...
just think that hits the nail on the head.
It does.
And also, like Heidegger's, works on metaphysics where he says the poet is like superior to the philosopher because where the philosopher just eats around the edge, the poet creates an aperture in the metaphysical reality.
Perfect. Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because I wanted to suggest too that the poet exists in it's as though again, William James observes that what we refer to and what we take to be our consciousness and the discourse that we share in our ordinary goings about the world is only one form of consciousness, and there are many, many layers, and the dream layer, Stevens is able to present in a poem those, to move down from the surface level and to go underneath and to bring up whatever else is feeding, one's feeling about that reality. And so that reading becomes an activity, as the title of that poem, not reading, but reality is the activity of the most august imagination, which is, of course it is, and, it's...
The supremacy of the imagination is like we have imagination, feeling, and intellect. Reason and imagination and feeling. It's like the feeling is always, irrationality is always given like the highest call, but it is like you come to a living theory as a child, first we experience things while we imagine them, and then we figure them out. We always wanted to think, it's really like being immersed in something, like feeling and imagination that creates the metaphysics.
Exactly, and the movement of that. As Stevens says, the pleasures of merely circulating. And then there are, then it's, there are wonderful, not only does he make me and Susan happy, but he's very playful and he's a trickster as well, so that, for years and years I'm reading through the corpus, and I don't know how many years of reading through the corpus, one day I realized that I've always been reading dry birds in blue leaves as blue birds in dry leaves, but it's really dry birds in blue leaves. And I realized that, he's made that category error deliberately and waiting for the point when the penny was going to drop for the different readers. And then you say, well, why is he doing that? And then why is he doing that is because that makes the prompt of now, where else are there irregularities? Where else have I been missing, something? And then you're engaging the poem as though it's a world that you're the body of the poems, as though it's a world that you're discovering where you've missed out on something. Like there's a poem, Examination of the Hero in a Time of War, that's made up of 13 or 14 long stanzas, for each one 14 lines, except for the third that has 13 lines. And then you say, well, now why? And so that's another engagement for another, it's like Zen, American versions of Zen koans, meant to unsettle what you think is certain and always making you question whatever it is we think is real or we think is regular, that the regular is always irregular or irrational. I'm sorry.
I was wondering if Stevens was also writing music, because, and of course, there's a big dichotomy very often between music and meaning. It's just a wide gap. And, like, for example, that Old Man Asleep, some of the lines in there
Yeah, no.
Same music. And I can't describe it in refinement, but have you all dealt with that at all, or is that a theme to Steve's at all, the music he's writing?
It's, he doesn't, he talks about the music of the words. He himself did play music. He could read music, and he played, as a young man, he played the guitar, and his wife was an accomplished pianist, and she introduced him to some experimental music, and before that, in the Salon in New York, in the Ahrensburg studio, he was exposed to the experimental music of Edgar Varese, for example. So music was always something that was very important to him. And he would listen to the broadcasts of the Philharmonic on the radio every Sunday and look forward to those. But he doesn't refer specifically to composing his poems as though he were scoring music, but he does say that words are the only melodeon, and then he does title the first volume Harmonium for the particular kind of sound and context the harmonium would evoke, and a very American, local, sort of wonderfully homely kind of instrument, also portable, but oddly enough related to the Chinese sheng.
Also, I think your question sort of points to the difference between music and, I mean, to me, Shakespeare's sonnets, or To an Old Philosopher in Rome, or Peter Quince, is music. But why isn't it music? I mean, what is the difference? And that's what, between that and Beethoven, between that and the Schubert, or between what we call music and what we call poetry. I'm fascinated in oneness. Is there a oneness? And also, it's not just music, it's sight. Because the word viol that occurs in Peter Quince has violent in it. And it's the musical instrument. And it's the sight of that V-I-O-L. And the word Rome, the R's in the two R's in river, the way that sight, sound, and music are considered separate elements, but they are all crucial in a poem. And I wish I could explain it. I have no way to explain it, but I think it's the great mystery.
Well, I was just going to say maybe that's why so many poets do collages, because what you're describing is sort of
Susan.
I'm very interested in Emily Dickinson's manuscripts, and I think her late work perfectly, her late fragments and drafts, if you could see them, you would see that they are acoustic, visual, and word at one, and people, they can't, you have to see them to believe it.
I just want to go back to Peter Quince and the line at the top. No, the music is feeling and not sound. Yeah. Why does he put it as if it even could be an antithesis? Why does he put it that way? What's the point?
The
voice seems to disappear. Yeah, I'm just wondering about the line that says music is feeling and not sound. And I'm wondering why he puts it as if it were an antithesis when, of course, it's both feeling and sound.
But this is the point in the poem, and not sound, and thus is that when what I feel here in this room, desiring you, this is the one point where he kind of lapses into narrative of that there could be a woman in the room in blue, so that feeling, I think, breaks apart at that moment into personal desire. I mean, it could be that, you see what I'm saying? It could be that suddenly music is feeling and not sound, and thus it is that what I feel in this room, desiring you, that's another feeling.
Is music, and that is music. And that's what you were talking about, is that this complex of overpowering feeling, whether it's sound, it's oral, it's visual, it's desire, it's what he calls the verve of earth. You know, at the end of the Monothe de Monothe, where he talks about, that's a beautiful passage.
Great.
You didn't tell me the page number for that one, Susan?
Oh, no, I can't. I know. That's not one of my... I can do Idea of Order of Key West. That to me is like the most musical. And it just goes on. And then she sang Beyond the Genius of the Sea. What does that... There's no meaning. It's just the meaning is in the sound. The genius of the sound. I just can't get over that poem. I mean, it's beyond. But on the Idea of Order at Key West, it's just.
I wanted to say about the dichotomy about music and sound. So much music doesn't actually sound. I mean, that's one of the dilemmas of talking about music. Now, you're talking about music as audible, or you're talking about the music that people carry around in their heads, which is a huge thing that musicians are getting to pay a lot of attention to. Is that
Now, what do you mean? Music that you...
that you carry around in your head. Music, as you, for instance, if you're playing a mute...
Like a clavier.
Yeah.
Clavier, you don't have to be making sound, actual sound that somebody else can hear.
You're making
sound,
it, but...
You're here, you're involved with sound that's very real. You're evoking, inhabiting a sound that precisely because nobody else can hear it is all the more music. It's all.
But isn't that all of... I mean, if I hear a certain tune, I'll be overwhelmed with nostalgia, say. But that's all me. Someone else hearing the tune wouldn't be overwhelmed. I mean, we're all isolated.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about
But
that. I'm talking about the thing that comes to you as you're walking down the street, the melody that goes through your mind.
Through your mind. Oh, I see, through your mind.
Or if you're a musician and you look at a score. and
Yeah,
you
right.
You hear what's coming out
Yeah.
of the page, which is a sound you can never hear in a concert. It's your own involvement with the sound. It's very, very powerful.
And I think it is the case, in fact, that experience of silent sounding activates the neuronal frame much more intensely than actually sounding it out, which is so that there's a sense of the brain being actually hotter, and working harder as it's doing that.
But very often the actual sound is a distraction.
Yeah. And that, the interior paramour being the activity of this thing that we have, this instrument that's always attuning us in some way to...
Well, it's like it was her voice that made the sky acute instead of vanishing. She measured to the hour its solitude. She was the single artificer of the world in which she sang. And when she sang, the sea, whatever self it had, became the self that was her song, for she was the maker. I mean, I think that poem touches on this dilemma that you're talking about.
There was someone behind them. Yes, sir.
It seems very much the case that in Stevens, the world is saturated with mind, and the mind is saturated with the world. And the sound is one of the major ways that this occurs in his poetry, all the way through, from the course of a particular, where the leaves are crying.
Right.
Human attribute.
Yeah.
But if you go back to that's almost the end. But at the very beginning of his poetry, they say the snowman.
Oh, God.
One must have a mind of winter, and then a few lines later, not to think of any misery in the sound of the land, which is the sound of a few leaves, and so on.
Yeah.
So this mixture of mind and world happening through sound is much of the music, I think, of Stevens. And it's you're interested in pragmatism. It's like John Dewey's notion that experience is never just given. It's always moment to moment being made.
Exactly.
And given form.
Exactly.
Given and taken, the Dewey dichotomy is given and taken. The word taken is the opposite of given in Dewey.
Yes, ma'am.
Thinking of the dichotomy between words and music, or the relationship, basically, you cannot tell a specific anecdote through music. You can't say that Rome was wearing a red dress in music. Nobody can. But you get the feeling, and the way that words come from your Emily Dickinson, and let's say Mallarmé, the way the words come closest to music is if they lose their specific grammatical context and really cease trying to tell an anecdote, but try to be more like music in their conveying of feelings. In Mallarmé, you very often really can't tell what he's trying to say. And in Emily Dickinson, the grammar is so suppressed, condensed, elliptical, that it becomes a form of music, like pizzicati, as you say. And then there are instances where people have tried to write music only by using words, with no melody. There's a few, may have been Poulenc, I'm not sure about that, where people are just saying words and then somebody comes in with the same words, like Frere Jacques, except that there's no tune. And they border on each other without ever being convergent, in my opinion.
And, well, it's just, but there, I don't know what.
Can I ask about a poem you read earlier? I think it was from Aurora.
The mother, I
think that the line, I don't have the text in front of me. I think the line was the necklace is not a
yeah,
kiss.
carving, yes.
And you interrupted your reading and said, I love that line.
Yeah.
But to me, that's a very opaque line. We were talking about how some of these...
Well, wait, all right, tell me, what do you mean that's an opaque line?
What I wanted to ask was, and when you said you love that line, is there anything else about that love?
Well, I do think that poetry actually comes down to lines, and one beautiful thing in Stevens is his use of enjambment, how he moves, and this isn't well, it is sort of, but I mean, that's where he's absolutely brilliant, the way it'll just stop and then move around to the next line. But that line, to me, the necklace is a carving, not a kiss. I just think it's so brilliant because it's death. I mean, that, a necklace is worn, sort of to be, you're given a gift of a necklace. A necklace is a beautiful thing around your neck. But then it becomes a carving, not a kiss. There's the neck, carving, and kiss. All those cut sounds, which are cruel. I mean, they're cutting sounds, literally. And the idea of a necklace as cutting, it's just...
Or a kiss is cutting.
And a kiss is cutting. I mean, that there's death in the kiss that gave the necklace. I mean, there's something about the thing.
Which is the poem you're talking about?
It's a section from Aurora's, and it's just a beautiful section about the mother. And it's a beautiful section about of beginning comfort and what a mother gives. I mean, the auroras of autumn, and there's where's the auroras?
That line has always puzzled me.
But I mean, that's what I get from, maybe I'm really twisted, and so twisted that I love that twisted line. But,
While you're looking for the poem, I want to tell you a necklace anecdote. I was trying to buy a necklace this weekend, and I took my daughter to the store, and she said, Mother, you'll never wear it. It's too fancy. And I said, well, then you can marry me in it.
oh, there you go.
But it's also that, the C, the K, that original long poem, you comedianize the letter C, where the point is to exploit all the sounds of the letter C and see what comes out
That's
from
true.
doing that, and the richness of, and what do these animal sounds, like gutturals and
Well, so, here now, but listen, right after that, it's the soft hands are emotion, not a touch. The house will crumble and the books will burn. They are ease and a shelter of the mind, and houses of the mind, and they in time together all together. Boreal night will look like frost as it approaches them, and to the mother as she falls asleep, and as they say, good night, is so brilliant that good night, good night. Upstairs the windows will be lighted, not the rooms. A wind will spread its windy grandeurs round and knock like a rifle butt against the door. The wind will command them with invincible sound. And by the way, I think he got the idea for that stanza from Virginia Woolf to the Lighthouse Time Passes chapter. Nobody else but me thinks that, but I don't know. I think I'm really clever. I mean, he did have all the
he was reading Virginia Woolf at that time as well.
He had all the Hogarth Press books. But somehow, the best line in that whole thing is the necklace is the burning.
There's a question over there.
I was just going to say that it's also very visual. All of a sudden, I've seen this necklace come in a piece of sculpture that's just by itself. So I think that might be in there also.
Right. That's true.
I'm not familiar with this poem, but you said it had something to do with a mother or...
Well, it's mother and father. This chapter is the mother.
I mean, it gives me the sense of a small child.
Yes.
And night coming on,
Right.
and, the great wind, and there's something of reckoning. And you could almost think of the child as climbing up on a mother's lap and expecting a kiss, and then all of a sudden it's a carving, which is, as you said, it's a very hard sound, and it's something inanimate.
That's right. And it's the inanimate thing. That's crucial.
Yeah, so that's interesting.
It's all that in one line. What?
If your imagination with the kisses over here on a woman, it gives a feeling of something more profound and transitory where the necklace is there. Like if you gave someone a diamond necklace, they have it forever. Kisses around.
Right.
It just seems to like, when you say kissing and you just have the necklace, my imagination sees the kissing here.
True.
It gives it a transitory feeling.
True.
The kiss is also something that he might want to receive from her, which is not, and that necklace is a very different kind of experience than that.
That very much so. And you had a...
Yeah, I was going to say this whole idea of, is he making music? And going back to that essay that you began with, where he talks about people making the rational to the irrational. And he writes poetry because that is how he does it.
Exactly.
So that the musician writes music because that's how they do it.
Exactly right. Yeah.
And I feel that you don't have him making.
And he
He's
talks...
making poetry. I mean, because
He loves the
that's
language.
the way he is.
Yeah, he talks about the poet must love the words in the way that a man loves a woman. And he does.
With that. But I was also going to say, even though I don't know the one you're talking about the letter C, the letter C is the only letter in the alphabet that does not have a sound of its own. It either has the S sound or the K sound.
Oh, that sound. See there, I'm thinking of all that.
It's always masquerading as something else, as the poet is also.
It could be all these different things.
And it's also for him, it's also the speed of light, and it's that magic of the speed of light and the fact that
It has a lot of meanings, but it has no sound.
But that's the kind of thing you've got to do with him. You've got to go look up the dictionary and see all these things. The dictionary is fascinating, really.
the dictionary becomes an extension of the poetry. I mean, it's as though the dictionary itself is a poem. And he'll, it's, Stevens was deeply moved by Emerson, and his mother had given him the complete set of Emerson when he graduated from high school before going to Harvard. And Emerson's wonderful, wonderful observation that every word was once a poem. Stevens makes, in fact, he makes that to be the case in the way he uses each of the words in his poems. Sir, you had a question before? Oh, no?
Was he also a student of Whitman's poem?
Oh, yeah, Whitman. Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, my God.
Almost mystical involvement in nature.
Totally. And, I mean, Whitman, talk about music.
I think that I'd just like to punctuate this part of our conversation with two sections from An Ordinary Evening in New Haven, which is one of Susan's favorite poems as well. Susan has brought up, I think, the very real consideration that this very long poem is in part Stevens' an extended conversation with Jonathan Edwards, and Jonathan Edwards, an 18th century minister who Susan has written so beautifully about, reminding us of how he composed his poems. In the beginning of the Souls of the Labadie tract, Susan writes, titles Errand. During his ministry in Northampton, Jonathan Edwards traveled alone on horseback from parish to parish. Boston was a 3-day ride east. It was easier to get to Hartford and New Haven. At Greenfield, the Mohawk Trail began its climb westward toward eastern New York, then frontier territory. As an idea occurred to him, he pinned a small piece of paper on his clothing, fixing in his mind an association between the location of the paper and the particular insight. On his return home, he unpinned each slip and wrote down its associated thought according to location. Quote, extricate all questions from the least confusion by words or ambiguity of words so that the ideas shall be left naked. That's Edwards. Poetry, writes Susan, is love for the felt fact stated in sharpest, most agile, and detailed lyric terms. Words give clothing to hide our nakedness. I love to imagine this gaunt and solitary traveler covered in scraps, riding through the woods and fields of Massachusetts and Connecticut. And that spiritual being is shared by Stevens, who always had little pieces of paper in his pockets. He was very, very, he was more than thrifty. He was actually stingy, even when he was quite well off. But he'd cut dry cleaning bills and use the backs of all these pieces of paper. Nothing was ever wasted, and as nothing was wasted in the Edwards household, and he had these in his pocket. And he would also sort of have some kind of indication of location about a particular image and where it came. And this, it's a way, I think one should remember that poems, especially for Stevens, he actually became the poet he did once he stopped keeping a journal, and that these poems are a record of his going through his life, of going around the sun more than 70 times. He becomes very aware of that journey around and around, and making a notation of what the changes in each year as he moves toward the last volume of work, which is called The Rock, when he's almost ready to become part of The Rock himself again. So this is pretty much, this is getting towards the end, this dialogue with Edwards in Ordinary Evening in New Haven. This is section 30. The last leaf that is going to fall has fallen. The robins are là-bas. The squirrels and tree caves huddle together in the knowledge of squirrels. The wind has blown the silence of summer away. It buzzes beyond the horizon or in the ground, in mud under ponds where the sky used to be reflected. The barrenness that appears is an exposing. It is not part of what is absent, a halt for farewells, a sad hanging on for remembrances. It is a coming on and a coming forth. The pines that were fans and fragrances emerge, staked solidly in a gusty grappling with rocks. The glass of the air becomes an element. It was something imagined that has been washed away. A clearness has returned. It stands restored. It is not an empty clearness, a bottomless sight. It is a visibility of thought in which hundreds of eyes in one mind see at once. And then the last section. The less legible meanings of sounds, the little reds not often realized, the lighter words and the heavy drum of speech, the inner men behind the outer shields, the sheets of music and the strokes of thunder, dead candles at the window when day comes, fire foams and the motions of the sea, flickings from Finnegan to find Finnegan, and the general fidget from busts of Constantine to photographs of the late President Mr. Blank. These are the edgings and inchings of final form, the swarming activities of the formulae of statement, directly and indirectly getting at, like an evening evoking the spectrum of violet, a philosopher practicing scales on his piano, a woman writing a note and tearing it up. It is not in the premise that reality is a solid. It may be a shade that traverses a dust, a force that traverses a shade. Just, like, why go on? There's also
Well, I'd suggest a comment on, I don't know what he was referring to in the Finnegan, but anyway, the question of music words. First discusses what's the universal language. It says not music, and not gesture, and not words, but sort of the gift of tongues. And that's, of course, what he plays with as universal language. The point is, you never get to music if you have to stick with the words. The reference to Finnegan, when he thought of the gift of
Finnegan.
Finnegan.
Oh, not Finnegan.
No, not Finnegan.
However,
the reference on sound is, instead of saying her kingdom come, his kingdom come, his will be done on earth as it is in heaven, he plays it as, her sing time sung, her will be run on heaven as it is uneven. And you say he's playing with the words as music, getting the rhythm. But of course, the meaning of the words is also there, because his God is the river run. So naturally, her will be run, her sing time sung, on heavens as it is uneven, isn't just the sound play on earth as it is on heaven. It's got the meaning of the words. And I felt that distinction has to be recognized. I don't know, I was very interested, it's a question, not a comment, the connection between Stevens and James and Santayana at Harvard, because there was the distinction of concretions in perception and concretions in discourse in Santayana's Life and Reason. And your quote of James came very close to that, seeing the world in perception and discourse, and the difference between the realm of sound and the realm of words. It seems to me that despite the boundary crossing, that has to be kept.
the difference between sound.
Between music and words. The words have
Well, I know, but well, I just, you think of it You think it has to be kept? It is different. I know. You're right. But I can't. But I have to say, you did bring up Finnegan's Wake. I think the end, the final poem I had on that handout, in the first poem, the drowsy motion of the river R. Well, the second to last poem is the River of Rivers in Connecticut. In Connecticut. And I think the end of that poem is an absolute bow to the end of Finnegan's Wake, which is the Liffey, the gorgeous, beautiful language of the end of Finnegan's Wake, which is as beautiful as the Song of Solomon. Honestly, it's biblically beautiful. And I remember that James Merrill, the poet, who read Stephen's poetry just beautifully, saying that for him, Stephen's, all he can say is, it's like reading the Psalms. And so there is something where Joyce rises to the level of prayer. I think it's prayer in a secular time or whatever that is almost music. I mean, to me, Joyce is in Finnegan's Wake when it's, there's an awful, I can't read the whole of Finnegan's Wake, but my God, the end of that thing. What is it? It's something between. Maybe it's betweenness. The idea of betweenness is the thing that's fascinating. What do you think about between? I mean, that they're not the same music and words, but there's something between. And it's in that betweenness that the huge something is. That's an
I'd like to say something to that.
Yeah.
I work with tone perception using color as the color and tone equation, not in the sense of synesthesia, but in the sense that tone is very direct and color is very direct, and so one can access feelings about tone, even concepts about tone, through color and color sets just intuitively selected. And when I got to really, really working very intensively with the most complex piece of music in my life, I was then able to read Finnegan's Wake.
Oh, there you go. Oh, interesting.
Several times. I just couldn't put it down.
Wow.
This work is exactly what you're describing.
Yeah.
Right in between, which is where I thought my brain was right in between two dissimilar worlds that were somehow intuitively connectable, whether permanently or in a transient sense. But I think you put your finger on something very interesting.
That's very
well. Thank you for this, because I don't know.
The Mozart piano quartet in G minor, which I think is played by very many people. Many people play it. Absolutely loathe the experience of playing it because it's a piece that transforms ordinary tones that you create sometimes into experiences that are so disagreeable that you almost can't put your finger on the first note. There are very few compositions that achieve that.
And that kind of irritation or that kind of juxtaposition of form against content happens very often in Steve, and that's why it's so difficult to read. It looks like a sentence. It sits on the page like a sentence, but it's not a sentence in any normal way of reading a sentence. And it's part of what Stevens was attempting to grapple with his own experience was to understand quantum reality, for the Planck constant, and trying to find a way of describing this counterintuitive, this way of being, and trying to create a language that would be at least disruptive of the comfort that we took where we used to be, but at the same time provide some of the comfort of familiar rhythms, of familiar sounds. I mean, the things that stayed with him from childhood, from hearing the hymns and hearing the psalms, and over and over.
Hearing you read, I kept shifting back and forth. I mean, a lot of it was very easy to hear as music, and you kind of lose the sense of the meaning of the word. going.
But that's what makes it great. I mean, you might just fade off into kind of Vatic, sort of, but something gets you back there. I mean, that's the balance act.
Yeah.
That's so brilliant. Like it's that VIOL in that line. You know,
I was going to say, what you say, when you talk about choice, music, it's the rhythm in the words. And that is the two things that they have in common. Music and poetry, music is choice. Choice of words, and the rhythm depends on those words. Music.
Joyce lives in those two
Yes,
worlds.
but, yes, but,
you know it by heart. You're really good.
with you is the gift of tongues, which in a prayer service really meant that you spoke words, and yet they became meaningless because you copied the rhythm of prayers, and that's why you go to church with the gift of tongues, and he was doing that with all those different language puns. But whatever you take, as the person said, you read along, you still come back to the words, which you don't in Mozart. In that sense, you're right entirely that it's in between, it's the boundaries, and that's part of the exciting thing. And Stephen, the music and the reference to music. But still, you do need to recognize the difference. Each thing is what it is and not another thing. And the poem is not a sonata. I'll give you a very simple illustration, Joyce. It's just a rhyme. It's as semper as oxhouse hemper. Oxhouse humper. It's as semper as oxhouse humper. And you say that's a nursery rhyme. But he meant the words. Semper is always. It says always. It's as simple. It's as simple as ABC. It's as always as the hieroglyphic oxhouse and humper is Aleph, Bet, Gimel, ABC. Ox is the Aleph, Bet is the house, Gimel, camel is the humper. So he didn't lose track in the music, in the simple nursery rhyme, it's as semper as oxhouse humper, that he was doing a complex word pun. And the words have meanings if you unpack them.
Okay, wait a
And
minute.
the same is true of Stevens. I don't know Stevens nearly as well as I know Joyce, so I meant to ask.
You sure know Joyce. I'm so impressed.
The point is
By
that,
heart.
isn't it true in Stevens that the word counts? The words count, not the music, the word.
No, not. But wait a minute. I want to just say one thing.
Words are the only melodium.
I just saw the most incredible at the City Opera. Beckett's this last work called Neither, with Morton Feldman's music, and in the end, it's just the soprano. There's a tiny little text that they put across the top, that flash on TV, but there's no words. All the soprano does is sing, is make these cries without words. And that's what Beckett finally, at the very end of his writing, he's trying to, it's used, and I'm just saying it's interesting because it's there's a fusion there that has to actually do away with words.
Look, they say all arts inspire to the state of music. This is a cliche that's been going on for
True, okay.
And the words, when you eliminate the words, you're turning to pure music. If she's singing something and it doesn't have any...
But it was just incredibly moving. I can't describe it.
Music is
No, I know that, but it wasn't. No, she was making cries. And she was going, you know what I mean? It was like, it almost was a word. And there were a few words up there.
We have time for one or two more questions, and then I would like to read one more poem before we leave. And then
I'd just like to mention Meredith Monk, which I just would like to say.
Yeah.
She learned from emotion, and listening of the language. The essence of the meaning of the word is just that.
Which, It was one can really.
is there another question? Okay, I'll read one of my very, very, very favorite poems. Long and sluggish lines. It makes so little difference at so much more than 70 where one looks. One has been there before. Wood smoke rises through trees, is caught in an upper flow of air and whirled away, but it has often been so. The trees have a look as if they bore sad names and kept saying over and over one same thing in a kind of uproar because an opposite, a contradiction, has enraged them and made them want to talk it down. What opposite? Could it be that yellow patch, the side of a house, that makes one think the house is laughing? Or these essent pre-personae, first fly, a comic infanta among the tragic drapings, babyishness of forsythia, a snatch of belief, the spook and makings of the nude magnolia? Wanderer, this is the pre-history of February. The life of the poem in the mind has not yet begun. You were not born yet when the trees were crystal, nor are you now in this wakefulness inside a sleep.